The United States is one of the most religiously diverse societies in history, and in many ways, the U.S. is uniquely positioned to demonstrate the power and necessity of interfaith cooperation. Our religious diversity is growing, but it is not entirely new. Even before the colonies became the United States, they experienced an ever-increasing religious diversity. In previous lessons, we've seen the ways in which religious diversity in the United States influences social capital, and how some groups have responded to our increasing religious diversity. Responses to diversity in the U.S. have ranged from antagonistic to constructive. Although it has not always been easy or successful, America has produced remarkable models of cooperative bridge building.
Some of the historical interfaith leaders that we'll discuss were connected to specific social movements, like Martin Luther King Jr. Some were politicians, like Thomas Jefferson. And some, like Moses Seixas, were just trying to make their community a better place for everyone. Although interfaith cooperation has been around about as long as religious difference, the term itself is relatively modern. Several of the people we are going to discuss would not have identified themselves as interfaith leaders or even recognized that what they were doing was in the model of interfaith cooperation. However, since their work and methods resonate strongly with what the interfaith movement has become, we can identify some of these people retroactively as models of interfaith leadership.
Religious diversity has always been present in the United States and has always been increasing. Several key moments in history have had a significant impact on this diversity and led to more necessary and noticeable acts of interfaith cooperation. Rather than attempt a sweeping history of interfaith cooperation over the past few centuries, let's pull out some major highlights.
Many of the early European settlements in North America were religiously diverse. Rhode Island, founded in 1636 by Roger Williams as a refuge for religious minorities, quickly became a haven for people seeking religious freedom. Williams was himself a Baptist, but he welcomed people from across the colonies in Europe regardless of their religious beliefs. He mandated that residents in Rhode Island, then known as Providence Plantations, respect one another and work together despite their differences. As a firm believer in the separation of religion and state affairs, Williams sought an alternative to other colonies, where the religious order ruled all areas of life and demanded obedience to one particular church. He declared, "Forced worship stinks in the nostrils of God." Williams worked to forge positive, mutually beneficial relationships with local Native Americans. After learning about their religious traditions and perspectives, Williams swore to never attempt to convert or baptize a Native American as a Christian. Like interfaith leaders today who see their interfaith work as a part of their religious identity, Williams believed that it was his Christian mission to improve relations with the Native Americans, learn their ways and show them respect, and to provide a safe place where individuals with different beliefs could still come together as one community.
During the colonial era, most of the European colonists were Christian, representing a wide array of Protestant denominations as well as the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. In 1763, the Touro Synagogue was founded in Newport, Rhode Island, making it the first synagogue in North America. Jewish communities were soon formed up and down the East Coast during America's earliest years. In the immediate aftermath of the Revolutionary War, Moses Seixas, the leader of the Jewish community in Newport, wrote a letter to the newly elected first president of the United States, inquiring about the fate of Jews in the new nation. Would they be harassed and hated as they had been for so many centuries elsewhere? In his response, George Washington assured the Newport congregation that they would not suffer the same persecutions and abuses they had suffered in Europe. He famously wrote, "The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." He concluded his letter, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Historians have pointed out that in a mere 340 words, Washington reassured a small group of Jews that they would be able to practice their religion freely and without interference, and established a critical precedent of interfaith respect and cooperation.
It's also important to remember that at this time, one of the largest groups of immigrants to what became the United States were enslaved West Africans, who brought with them a range of indigenous traditions, as well as, in many cases, Islam. Thus, a nation historically characterized by its large Protestant majority carried with it from its founding the seeds of religious diversity.
In addition to George Washington, many of the country's founders had a particular interest in religion and protecting religious liberty. Thomas Jefferson had a well-known interest in and respect for non-Christian traditions such as Islam. Along with James Madison, he successfully proposed language for the Constitution prohibiting religious tests for office and articulating that the federal government would never establish a national religion. In this religiously diverse democracy, all citizens would be free to observe their own religious practice. Diversity was recognized as an asset, not a liability. This guarantee of religious freedom has become the bedrock of American democratic liberalism and continues today to be a fundamental element of our national identity.
Religious diversity only increased as America both expanded its size and reputation for offering new beginnings to immigrants from abroad. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, America became the new home for millions of immigrants. Waves of Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Europe arrived in America. Neighborhoods, cities, and states were transformed as the new immigrants built churches and synagogues, established civic groups, created service and support organizations, attended schools and universities, and ran for political office. This is also when we begin to see the emergence of new religious traditions in the United States, including the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. These immigrants and newly emerging faith traditions had a vast impact on the religious diversity of the country. They were not always readily welcomed into society. In fact, there's a long and unpleasant history of both anti-Mormon and anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States. But even so, it was becoming increasingly impossible for people to not know someone who held different religious beliefs from their own.
In 1893, during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, an international gathering called the World's Parliament of Religions was organized. This 2-week event was the first gathering of religious and spiritual leaders and practitioners from across the globe, and is largely considered the birthplace of formal interreligious dialogue. The purpose of the Parliament was to foster positive relationships between the world's religious communities so that they could work together to guide the world toward a more peaceful and sustainable existence.
This was also the time for social entrepreneurs like Dorothy Day. Day drew upon resources from the Catholic Church to build connections with other religious and non-religious entities in order to provide care and support for the poorest of Americans. Her important justice work exemplifies Catholic social teaching, but also reaches beyond the boundaries of Catholic identity to bring together individuals and communities in order to care for those among them in need. We now consider Day to be a model of interfaith leadership, particularly because of her ability to mobilize different groups in order to work toward the common good.
During the world wars of the early 20th century, the United States came into contact with new types of global diversity and was forced to address rising concerns about religious difference at home. As Americans became aware of the atrocities done to European Jews at the hands of Nazis, it became clear that anti-Semitism was not a uniquely European problem, but that in fact many Americans held anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic views and were against the United States accepting so many refugees fleeing Europe.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews, formed in 1927 in order to teach Americans how to learn from one another's religious traditions and to identify the shared values among Protestant Christianity, Catholicism, and Judaism. Modeling interfaith dialogue and interfaith cooperation, representatives would travel around the country holding public forums, through which they combated existing anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism, and nurtured a sense of cohesion and community among all Americans.
Now let's skip ahead to the 1960s. It was an era of major change in the United States, including the nation's religious diversity. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the quota system on immigrants that had been in place since the 1920s, allowing new waves of immigration, particularly from Asia, Africa, and South America. Like earlier immigrants, these people brought with them their diverse religious traditions, including Hinduism, Sikhism, indigenous traditions, Buddhism, Shintoism, and Islam. The Immigration and Nationality Act marks a turning point in United States history because from that point forward, the cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity of the United States began to grow faster than ever before. The cultural and religious diversity we see around us today is possible in large part because of this moment in 1965.
The 1960s were also the height of the Civil Rights Movement, an era that wrote a profound chapter in the story of the American ethic of interfaith cooperation. The Civil Rights Movement typified the idea of people from all different faiths and ethics coming together for the common good. Men like A. Philip Randolph, a secular humanist, and Bayard Rustin, a Quaker, helped organize mass actions and protests and even bring more people together in events like the March on Washington. When Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, an Orthodox Jew and Holocaust survivor, took part in the Voting Rights March in 1965, he commented afterward, "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling. And yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs praying." And it was Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh who influenced Martin Luther King Jr. to take a stand against the Vietnam War toward the close of his life. It's hard to imagine the success of the civil rights movement without broad and vibrant interfaith coalitions.
This brings us back to our present moment of religious diversity. So how radical has the transformation of our nation been? More than half of the founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, during which the Constitution was framed and drafted, identified as Church of England or Episcopalians. Today, there are twice as many Muslims in the US as there are Episcopalians. Nearly 90% of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were Protestant. Since 2010, and for the first time in the country's history, the highest institution charged with interpreting and upholding the Constitution, the Supreme Court, doesn't have a single Protestant justice. New York City has 3 times more Jews than Jerusalem, and Greater Los Angeles contains the most complex and diverse Buddhist population of any city in the world. Now, certainly, not every corner of the United States is as religiously diverse as New York or Los Angeles, and indeed, many parts of the country might still look and feel largely the way they did a generation ago. But when these demographic changes are juxtaposed with 2 other trends, one, urbanization, or the increasingly large percentage of the country that lives in major urban areas, and 2, communications technology, most significantly the internet, it's fair to say that most Americans inhabit a far more religiously diverse environment than Roger Williams ever could have imagined when he set out to establish a land of religious liberty for all. It is important to repeat, however, that American history is not always an exemplar of interfaith cooperation. Alongside the moments that we have highlighted here, there have been many moments of religious conflict. One of the reasons we so admire interfaith leaders of the past is because they were battling such an ugly prejudice. You no doubt have personally seen instances of both positive and negative engagement with diversity. And as a country now more religiously diverse than ever, the type of leadership shown by these past movements and leaders is perhaps needed now more than ever.